The attempted arson at Jacob's shed sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. No one could believe that their small-town feud had escalated to this level. Yet despite the severity of what had happened, Karen still stalked the streets with her head high, muttering to anyone who would listen that Jacob's family had staged the fire themselves for attention. Most people rolled their eyes, but a few of her closest cronies on the HOA board nodded along, clinging to her story even as the sheriff's deputies quietly gathered evidence against her. Jacob, meanwhile, pressed on with his plans for the new animal shelter. Buoyed by the support pouring in from across the state, construction volunteers showed up on weekends. Donations of lumber, fencing, and pet supplies stacked high in his yard, and each passing day, Jacob felt a little closer to realizing his dream. But the shadow of Karen's anger never lifted. She began appearing more erratic, driving slowly past Jacob's house at odd hours, sitting in her car glaring at him while he worked, and filing endless complaints with the city about noise, smell, and zoning violations. Each one was investigated and dismissed. Yet the constant pressure wore on Jacob's family. His mother confessed one night at the dinner table that she was afraid Karen would hurt someone. His father clenched his fists and promised to protect them. But Jacob himself felt the weight of it all too. He loved his animals. He loved helping people. But he couldn't ignore the dark cloud hanging over them. The tension finally boiled over during the shelter's opening day, a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Attended by dozens of families, the mayor, and even local reporters, Jacob stood proudly with scissors in hand, ready to cut the ribbon when Karen suddenly stormed into the crowd. Screaming at the top of her lungs that everyone there was complicit in animal cruelty, she shoved people aside, knocking over a stroller, and tried to grab the microphone from the mayor. Chaos erupted. Children cried, and Jacob froze in shock. But before Karen could do more damage, the sheriff himself stepped forward. Taking hold of her arm and declaring loudly that enough was enough, she shrieked that this was a conspiracy and fought to break free. But deputies surrounded her and placed her in handcuffs. The crowd erupted in cheers, yet even as she was dragged away, she screamed threats at Jacob, swearing he would regret this. The scene was captured on live news cameras and quickly spread online. Painting her as the villain she had become, Jacob stood stunned, clutching his scissors, his mother wrapping an arm around him as his father whispered that it was over. But deep down, Jacob knew it wasn't. Karen had shown time and again that consequences didn't stop her. They only made her more desperate. Sure enough, within days, she posted bail and returned home, angry and unrepentant. The sheriff warned Jacob's family that she was now under strict monitoring, but Jacob still. He felt uneasy. He noticed her watching him from her yard. Glaring with such venom that he shivered, neighbors urged him to stay strong, reminding him that she was losing her power. The HOA board had voted to remove her after the shelter incident, and most of the town now despised her antics. Yet Karen clung to her bitterness. Sitting alone in her house plotting revenge one evening, Jacob received a letter slipped under his family's door, paper scrawled with shaky handwriting that read, "If you don't stop, something worse will happen." Jacob's father turned it over to the sheriff immediately. And though they suspected Karen, there was no way to prove it. Jacob, trembling, asked his parents if he should quit, if saving the animals was worth all this danger. His mother hugged him tightly and told him that what he was doing mattered more than Karen's hate, that giving up would only let her win. His father agreed, saying that Karen's obsession was tearing herself apart. Not them. Jacob tried to believe them. And as he went back to feeding the rabbits that night, he felt a renewed sense of determination. Karen's final strike was already looming, a plan so reckless that even her few remaining allies abandoned her. One stormy night, the cameras on Jacob's property caught a figure sneaking into the yard carrying a canister. She poured liquid near the new shelter and struck a match. But before the fire could catch, deputies, who had been monitoring her movements, swooped in and arrested her on the spot. This time the evidence was undeniable. Video footage, fingerprints, and eyewitness accounts tied her directly to the attempted arson. The community was stunned, but also relieved. Finally, the law had caught up to Karen in a way she could not escape. Jacob watched as squad cars lined the street, red and blue lights flashing through the rain. His parents holding him close as Karen screamed from the back of a cruiser, her reign of harassment ending not with a whimper, but with a desperate The failed act of destruction, Jacob felt tears on his cheeks, not of fear, but of release. The nightmare was finally ending. Yet even as Karen disappeared into the night, Jacob knew the scars would linger, the memory of her relentless attacks etched into his heart. But so too was the knowledge that he had stood firm, that the community had rallied behind him, and that in the end kindness and perseverance had outlasted cruelty and spite. Little did Jacob realize, however, that the fallout from Karen's arrest would ripple even further, shaking the very foundations of the HOA she once controlled and cementing his story as one that no one in town would ever forget. Karen's meltdown at the festival had been the breaking point for most of the community. But instead of backing down, she doubled her efforts to paint Jacob and his family as criminals. She began spreading flyers around the neighborhood claiming Jacob was running a dangerous animal trafficking ring out of his family's garage. The lies were outrageous, but still some fearful or gullible neighbors raised their eyebrows, though most simply crumpled the flyers and tossed them in the trash. Jacob, meanwhile, found himself busier than ever. Families across town were now calling his parents' phone, asking if he had more pets available for adoption. The local vet even offered him discounted checkups for the animals he rescued, saying he admired Jacob's heart and wanted to support him. All of this infuriated Karen, who sat by her window, glaring at their house every day, convinced that she just needed the right piece of evidence to bring him down. Late one evening, Jacob's father heard rustling near the shed where the pet cages were kept, and when he went outside, he caught Karen creeping around with her phone flashlight, peering into the cages as if hunting for violations. When he confronted her, she shrieked that she was documenting cruelty and bolted back to her house. Jacob's father called the police and they filed yet another report, but the officers warned that unless she physically harmed someone or broke in, their hands were tied. Still, Jacob's family pressed ahead with the restraining order process and the town's patience. With Karen wore thinner by the day, things escalated further when Karen filed a lawsuit against Jacob's parents, claiming that their son's pet stand was devaluing property in the neighborhood and disturbing her peace. It was a ludicrous case, but it forced Jacob's family into court. Jacob sat anxiously in the gallery, clutching his mother's hand as the judge listened to Karen rant about animals being loud and unclean. The judge, unimpressed, asked for actual evidence of laws being broken. Karen had none. The court threw out her case and fined her for wasting judicial time. Jacob felt a wave of relief, but Karen stormed out of the courthouse swearing that she would appeal. Neighbors who had attended to support Jacob shook their heads in disbelief, whispering that Karen had finally lost all sense. Jacob's parents began to consider moving for the sake of peace, but Jacob pleaded with them not to give up. He had worked so hard for the animals and believed the town needed him. They reluctantly agreed to stay and fight, bolstered by the wave of support surrounding them. Karen, however, saw this as a declaration of war. She began plotting behind closed doors with a small group of HOA board members who still tolerated her antics. They devised a scheme to ban all pet-related activities on neighborhood property, knowing it would directly target Jacob's stand. When the new bylaw was announced, families were outraged. Many who owned dogs or cats realized it would affect them too. Petitions flew around demanding the HOA reverse its decision. Jacob felt guilty that his battle was now pulling others into the mess, but people reassured him that Karen had gone too far. Even those who had previously stayed neutral now joined the opposition. The next HOA meeting was packed. Residents filled the room, shouting over Karen's attempts to justify the bylaw. Jacob's father stood and delivered a passionate speech about freedom, compassion, and how one boy's love for animals had become a source of community pride. Applause roared through the room, and the board was forced to table the bylaw due to overwhelming opposition. Karen, however, was not deterred. Her face twisted with rage as she pointed at Jacob, declaring, "This boy is ruining everything, and I will not rest until he is gone." The room fell silent at her outburst. Neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, and Jacob shivered, realizing she had made him her singular enemy. Later that week, Jacob's family woke up to find graffiti sprayed on their garage door reading "Animal Abuser." The handwriting was messy, but they suspected Karen immediately, though she denied it vehemently. When police investigated, they found no hard proof, leaving the family to scrub the hateful words off themselves. Jacob, however, refused to let despair win. He decided to organize a community adoption fair at the local park, inviting families to bring their pets, share stories, and help more. Rescued animals, find homes. The event turned into a huge success, with dozens of adoptions taking place, and the mayor himself stopping by to shake Jacob's hand. The story made headlines again, and once more Karen was humiliated as the entire town celebrated what she despised. But humiliation didn't stop her. She escalated again, this time trespassing into the park during Jacob's second fair. Screaming that all the pets were diseased and threatening to call animal control to have them all seized, parents shielded their children from her. Pets scattered in fear, and Jacob nearly broke down in tears, but the police, already present to monitor the large gathering, quickly intervened. Karen was escorted away in handcuffs for disorderly conduct. The sight of her being taken off by officers was met with cheers from the crowd. Yet Jacob couldn't shake the fear that she wasn't finished. After all, she had proven over and over again that consequences didn't deter her. They only fueled her obsession. As Karen sat in the holding cell that night, she stewed with fury, vowing that the next time she struck, it would be in a way that no one could undo. A way that would not just target Jacob's stand, but everything he and his family held dear. What she didn't realize was that her vendetta was building into something far larger than she could control. And when the final confrontation came, it wouldn't just be Jacob's dream at stake, it would be Karen's very freedom on the line. The days following Karen's arrest felt like a weight had been lifted off Jacob's family and the entire neighborhood. For the first time in months, Jacob could walk outside without feeling the burn of her eyes on him. No more frantic phone calls to the police, no more lies whispered at HOA meetings, and no more fear of what she might do next. The sheriff confirmed that Karen was facing multiple felony charges, including attempted arson, harassment, and violation of a restraining order. This time she wouldn't be getting out with just a fine or a warning. Jacob's parents sat him down and explained that while the fight had been long and painful, it had also shown the power of standing firm, of not letting bullies win. Jacob listened with tears in his eyes. Realizing how much he had endured for his animals and how many people had come to stand with him, at school his classmates treated him like a hero. Teachers congratulated him, and parents from around town thanked him for showing their kids what courage and compassion looked like. The shelter he had worked so hard for was now open, bustling with volunteers, children eager to help feed the animals, and families adopting pets into loving homes. Jacob felt a joy so deep it washed away months of fear. Yet the story didn't end there. Karen's trial became the talk of the town. Porters filled the courtroom as evidence was presented, including the security footage of her trying to set the shelter on fire. Her shrill denials rang hollow. The judge looked unimpressed as witness after witness testified about her harassment. From neighbors describing her stalking to police officers, recounting her repeated calls and disruptions. And then Jacob himself took the stand. His small voice steady, but filled with conviction as he explained why he sold pets, how he rescued animals, and how he only wanted to help. The courtroom fell silent as he told of Karen throwing over cages, frightening kittens, and screaming in children's faces. By the time he finished, even the judge seemed moved. In the end, Karen was found guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to prison time, along with mandatory counseling. Her HOA privileges revoked permanently, and an order issued banning her from any contact with Jacob or his family for life. The verdict was celebrated across town, the same community she had tried to control with fear, now breathed easier knowing she could no longer terrorize them. The HOA quickly replaced her leadership, rewriting bylaws to prevent abuse of power, and even issued a formal apology to Jacob's family. Jacob smiled shyly as they received it. Not out of pride, but out of relief that the nightmare had truly come to an end. His shelter grew steadily in the months that followed, attracting donations from across the state, veterinarians volunteering their time, and students eager to help. Care for the animals, what began as a boy's simple love for pets, had turned into a movement, a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness could withstand the darkest storms. Jacob often thought about Karen, not with hatred, but with sadness. wondering how a person could let anger consume them so completely, but he also knew that he couldn't dwell on her anymore. His focus had to remain on the animals who needed him and the people who believed in him. He held his head high each time a new family walked out of the shelter carrying a kitten, a puppy, or even a rabbit with smiles on their faces, knowing he had helped make it happen. The community that once feared Karen's wrath was now united in compassion, stronger and closer because they had stood together against her cruelty. Jacob had not only saved animals, but had also helped save his town from the grip of one woman's obsession. His story spread far beyond the borders of his small community, inspiring others who faced bullies, reminding them that standing firm, even when it feels impossible, can bring change. Jacob's journey wasn't easy, and it wasn't without scars, but it was proof that resilience, kindness, and unity could outlast even the worst cruelty. And as the sun set on his shelter, one evening, the animals quiet and families driving away with new companions, Jacob felt peace at last. For the boy who once trembled under the shadow of an HOA tyrant had now become a symbol of strength and hope for everyone around him. And if you've been inspired by Jacob's fight, by his courage against injustice, then don't let his story end here. Make sure to subscribe to Sham Stories so you never miss another tale of standing tall against the Karens of the world, because the next story may be the one that changes the way you see everything. The night after Karen was hauled off by police at the community fair should have been the end of it. But it was only the beginning of her most destructive phase yet. She was released with a citation and a stern warning to stay away from Jacob's family, but warnings had never stopped her before. Instead, she came back more bitter, convinced that the entire neighborhood was conspiring against her. She began making anonymous calls to animal control, reporting Jacob's stand as unsanitary and unsafe. The officers came out twice, only to leave shaking their heads when they found every animal clean, vaccinated, and cared for. One of them even patted Jacob on the back and told him to keep up the good work. This only made Karen more furious. She began driving around town at night, plastering posters on lampposts with Jacob's picture and the words "illegal pet dealer" scrawled across it. Jacob's father tore them down each morning, his face set in grim determination, but the constant harassment wore on the family. Jacob tried to stay strong, but at night he lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if Karen would ever stop. Still, the animals needed him, and he wasn't going to give up. His next big event was at the school gymnasium, where he had been invited to set up for an adoption day. Teachers and students volunteered to help, and dozens of families showed up. Karen, true to form, barged in halfway through, red-faced and screaming that the school was harboring criminals. The principal immediately called security, and she was escorted out, but not before she threw over one of the cages, sending terrified kittens scattering across the gym floor. Jacob's heart broke as he chased after them, but volunteers quickly helped gather the animals, and no one was hurt. The incident was captured on camera by multiple people and uploaded. Online, the videos spread fast, this time not just across town, but statewide, with viewers expressing outrage that a grown woman would terrorize a child and helpless animals. Jacob's story caught the attention of a regional news station, which aired a segment on his rescue work and the harassment he faced. Donations to his cause skyrocketed. People sent money, supplies, and even offers to foster animals. The positive attention bolstered Jacob's spirit. But Karen's wrath grew uncontrollable. She accused the media of slandering her, ranting in HOA meetings that Jacob was bribing reporters. Her fellow board members were embarrassed. Some began quietly distancing themselves from her, and a few even resigned, unwilling to be tied to her downward spiral. Jacob's father took this moment to push for the restraining order again, and this time, armed with video evidence, police reports, and community testimony. The judge granted it. Karen was officially barred from coming near Jacob, his stand, or his events, but the ink on the order was barely dry before she broke it. One evening, Jacob was helping his father clean the cages in their yard when Karen appeared at the end of their driveway, screaming that she would burn it all down if they didn't stop. Jacob's mother called 911 immediately, and officers came racing down the street. Karen was arrested for violating the restraining order, and this time she wasn't released with just a warning. She spent a night in jail. The humiliation should have ended her crusade, but it only hardened her further. She began writing angry posts on social media, railing against Jacob and accusing him of being part of a bigger scheme. The posts were filled with wild conspiracy theories, and while many people mocked her, others began to worry she was slipping into something darker. Jacob tried to stay focused on his animals, but the constant cloud of Karen's anger loomed over him. At one adoption fair at the town square, Jacob noticed Karen lurking just outside the perimeter, glaring at him, and though she didn't cross the line physically, her presence was unsettling. His parents notified police again, and she was issued another warning. Yet Jacob pressed on, refusing to let fear dictate his actions. It was during this period that a local animal welfare foundation reached out, offering him a grant to expand his rescue efforts. Jacob was overjoyed, envisioning a small shelter where he could house more animals safely. The town rallied around him, organizing fundraisers and volunteering their time. It was a moment of triumph that showed Karen hadn't broken him. But as the groundbreaking for the shelter approached, Karen plotted something far more dangerous. She began targeting not just Jacob but the entire neighborhood, writing threatening letters to neighbors who supported him, slashing the tires of cars parked near his events, and once even throwing paint across a supporter's front door. Though evidence was thin, everyone knew who was responsible. Whispers spread that Karen wasn't just a nuisance anymore, she was a threat. Jacob's parents grew fearful for their safety, installing cameras around the house and keeping close watch whenever Jacob was outside. Neighbors checked in on them, often vowing not to let Karen intimidate the boy who had brought so much good to the town. The tension reached a breaking point one night when Jacob awoke to the sound of barking dogs and saw smoke rising from near the shed where the animals were kept. His father ran out with a hose and discovered someone had tried to set a fire by piling newspapers against the wall. The flames were quickly extinguished, but the intent was clear. Jacob's parents called the sheriff, who launched a full investigation. The community was horrified, rallying even more firmly behind Jacob, demanding justice. Karen was questioned but denied everything, yet the sheriff wasn't convinced. He promised Jacob's family he would get to the bottom of it. Jacob, though shaken, stood tall the next morning, determined not to let fear break him, and his word of the arson attempt spread, so too did the outrage. The community that Karen thought she could control was now united against her. And Jacob's mission to save animals had become something far bigger, a symbol of hope against bullying, cruelty, and unchecked abuse of power. But Karen wasn't finished. She still had one last move to play. And it was the one that would finally force the truth into the light for everyone to see. The moment you hear that a grown woman decided to declare war on a young boy just because he was selling pets in town, you realize you're about to witness one of the most outrageous HOA Karen stories ever told. And if you want to hear exactly how this petty feud spiraled so far out of control that it shook the entire community, make sure you stay with me until the end and subscribe to Sham Stories, because this one will leave you speechless. It all started on a warm Saturday morning when 12-year-old Jacob set up a small table near the edge of his family's driveway, neatly arranging cages of rabbits, a few kittens, and some puppies his family had rescued. His parents had taught him responsibility by allowing him to care for the animals and sell them for small adoption fees to good homes. Jacob wasn't in it for profit. He was saving money to buy a new bicycle and also wanted to find loving families for the pets. Neighbors passing by stopped to admire the animals. Children giggled as they petted the rabbits, and families asked about the puppies. It was wholesome, innocent, and exactly the kind of scene that made small-town life feel special, but not too. Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA, who lived 3 doors down and was always searching for reasons to impose her power on others. She stormed down the street the moment she saw Jacob's little setup, her sharp eyes narrowing as though a crime had been committed right under her nose. She placed her hands on her hips and barked, "What is this? You can't run a business here. This is against HOA rules," startling the boy and his mother, who had been sitting on a lawn chair beside him. Jacob stammered nervously, explaining he wasn't running a business, just finding homes for the pets, but Karen wasn't interested in reason. She sneered and wagged her finger at him like he was a hardened criminal. saying the street wasn't a flea market, and accusing his family of bringing down the neighborhood's value. Several neighbors overheard and gathered nearby, frowning at her tone, but Karen was relentless. She demanded Jacob pack up immediately, threatening fines and legal trouble. The boy's mother calmly told her that there was no violation because they weren't breeding animals or running a commercial shop, it's just helping pets find homes. But Karen whipped out her phone, snapping pictures of the cages and the boy as if she were documenting evidence for a major trial. The neighbors shook their heads at her dramatic behavior. One elderly man muttered, "For heaven's sake." Karen let the boy be, but she turned on him too, insisting that rules were rules. Her voice rising louder and louder, the confrontation escalated when Jacob, close to tears, begged her not to ruin his pet sale, explaining softly that he needed to help pay for a new bike. The crowd murmured sympathetically, but Karen scoffed cruelly, mocking him by saying, "If you want money, get a paper route, not run a circus in front of your house." The cruelty of her words shocked everyone, and Jacob's mother finally stood up, her face tight with anger, demanding Karen leave them alone. But instead, Karen pulled out her phone and threatened to call the police, saying she would report Jacob for illegal street vending. The neighbors gasped, several speaking out at once, telling her she was overreacting. But Karen pressed the phone to her ear anyway, pacing dramatically while glaring at Jacob's setup. The boy hugged one of the puppies tightly, shaking with fear as tears rolled down his cheeks. His mother wrapped her arms around him, whispering that everything would be okay, and though she looked calm on the outside, her eyes burned with fury at Karen's cruelty. Within minutes, police cars arrived, lights flashing, neighbors filming. The unbelievable scene, officers stepped out, clearly confused to find a small boy selling pets while a woman ranted hysterically about HOA rules. The officer approached Karen first, listening to her complaints about bylaws, property value, and neighborhood order, then walked over to Jacob and his mother. Seeing the cages of pets and the adoption sign reading, "Loving Homes Needed, Small Fee," the officer's face softened. Realizing immediately this wasn't a business scheme but a child's heartfelt project, Jacob's mother explained calmly that her son was only rehoming rescued animals and not violating any law. And the officer nodded, telling Karen firmly that this was not a police matter, that nothing illegal was happening. But Karen's face turned bright red with rage. She shrieked that the HOA had rules, that the officer had to enforce them. But he calmly told her that HOA rules weren't the same as the law, and unless there was a crime, the police had no reason to intervene. Karen sputtered in disbelief, her authority crumbling in front of everyone. Neighbors whispered to each other, some even chuckling as Karen's tantrum became more ridiculous. Jacob wiped his tears and asked timidly if he could continue selling his pets, and the officer smiled gently, patting his shoulder and saying, "Of course, son. You're not doing anything wrong?" The crowd applauded, neighbors clapped, and Jacob's face lit up with relief. But Karen exploded, screaming that this wasn't over, that she'd have the HOA fine the family thousands of dollars and shut them down. Her voice was so loud and shrill that one officer had to warn her to calm down or risk being cited for disturbing the peace. Karen stomped off toward her house, her face twisted with fury, muttering about calling the HOA president immediately, but the damage was done. She had humiliated herself in front of the entire neighborhood and failed to stop a 12-year-old boy from helping his pets. Yet what nobody knew then was that this incident was just the beginning. Karen wasn't done with Jacob or his family, and she was about to escalate her vendetta in ways that would backfire spectacularly and bring her more shame than she could have ever imagined. So stay tuned, because what happens next will show just how far Karen was willing to go to bully a child, and how the community, the law, karma itself came crashing down on her. Subscribe now to Sham Stories so you don't miss the next unbelievable turn in this jaw-dropping drama. The days following the first confrontation should have been quiet, but Karen had no intention of letting the matter rest. She believed that allowing Jacob to continue his pet adoption table would be a personal defeat, so she set out on a campaign of intimidation that made the entire neighborhood shake their heads in disbelief. First, she called an emergency HOA meeting, plastering flyers on mailboxes and sending mass emails claiming there was illegal animal trafficking happening right on their block. Her words were exaggerated and inflammatory, painting Jacob's innocent pet adoption as though it were some sinister underground operation. Most of the neighbors rolled their eyes at her dramatics, but a few curious residents attended, only to watch Karen stand at the front of the HOA clubhouse clutching photos of Jacob's little table like they were evidence from a crime scene. She shouted about bylaws, noise, and property values, demanding that the HOA take immediate action. But when some residents pointed out that Jacob wasn't breaking any actual rules, Karen grew red in the face and snapped at them for being soft. Her obsession was becoming clear. Meanwhile, Jacob tried to go about his normal routine, setting up his table on the weekends with his mom nearby. But Karen would march by daily, photographing everything. Sometimes even yelling insults like, "Go play with toys, this isn't your place to run a zoo." The boy, once cheerful and eager, grew more anxious, glancing over his shoulder whenever he saw Karen's figure appear. His mother reassured him, reminding him that the officer had already said he was doing nothing wrong, but she too was growing. Tired of the harassment, matters escalated when Jacob's father, returning from a work trip, learned what had been happening. He was furious to hear that a grown woman had been tormenting his son. He confronted Karen one morning when she started berating Jacob again, standing tall in front of her and demanding she'll leave his family alone, Karen, rather than backing down. Pointed her phone at him and threatened to report him for harassment. Neighbors watching shook their heads, knowing how twisted Karen could spin stories. Jacob's father kept his composure, telling her calmly but firmly that if she didn't stop, he'd seek legal action for harassment against her. Karen sneered and stormed off, but her eyes glinted with determination. She wasn't backing down, she was escalating, and within days, Jacob's family began receiving official-looking letters from the HOA, each one threatening fines of hundreds of dollars for unauthorized commercial activity and public nuisance. Jacob's father read them aloud in disbelief, his anger growing with each line. The boy's mother tried to hide the letters from Jacob, not wanting him to worry. But he overheard one evening and burst into tears, saying through sobs, "I didn't mean to do anything wrong. I just wanted to help the pets." His parents hugged him tightly, assuring him none of this was his fault. But inside, they were determined not to let Karen win. Jacob's father attended the next HOA meeting, carrying a thick binder of documents including the adoption records, the police officer's statement, and even testimonies from neighbors who supported Jacob. When Karen began railing again about illegal businesses, Jacob's father stood, calmly presenting the facts, pointing out that nothing in the HOA's bylaws prohibited what his son was doing. The room grew tense as residents shifted uncomfortably, some realizing they had been dragged into Karen's personal vendetta, the HOA board. Clearly tired of her dramatics, hesitated to back her claims, but Karen shouted over everyone, calling Jacob's father a liar, accusing neighbors of being biased, even daring to say that Jacob himself was manipulating the community. Which made everyone gasp. The idea of accusing a 12-year-old boy of manipulation revealed just how far gone Karen had become. One board member finally stood and told her she was out of line, that personal grudges weren't the same as legitimate violations. Karen screamed back that she'd take the matter to the top if they refused to act, storming out of the meeting in a fury, slamming the door so hard it rattled the walls. The fallout from the meeting was immediate. Neighbors began to talk, among themselves more openly, some admitting they had long been tired of Karen's antics, but had been too afraid to speak up. Jacob's family received dozens of supportive notes, cookies, and even donations toward Jacob's bike fund. People wanted him to know he was appreciated, not bullied, but Karen's harassment didn't stop. She doubled down, calling animal control on the family, claiming the pets were being neglected or mistreated. Animal control officers arrived one morning to conduct a surprise inspection, and Jacob's mother, though shocked, invited them in, showing the well-fed, healthy animals, the clean cages, and even vet records proving the pets were cared for properly. The officers left satisfied, complimenting Jacob on how well he had looked after the animals. But Karen, watching from across the street, shouted accusations at them as they walked back to their car. The officers ignored her, leaving her fuming. Jacob's parents filed a complaint with local authorities, documenting her harassment, but Karen, rather than being deterred. Bragged around the neighborhood that she would make sure that boy never sells another pet again. She was blind to the fact that every step she took only made her look worse. By now, Jacob had become something of a symbol in the community. Neighbors admired his perseverance, and when Karen's name came up, people rolled their eyes, shaking their heads at her cruelty. What had started as a simple table of pets had now turned into a community-wide battle between decency and tyranny. And though Karen thought she was gaining ground with her endless letters, complaints, and tantrums, the reality was that she was isolating herself more and more. The sheriff himself, having been briefed by the earlier officers, began quietly monitoring the situation, warning the HOA board that if Karen's harassment continued, legal action could be taken. But Karen, in her arrogance, laughed it off, believing she was untouchable. What she didn't realize was that her obsession was about to push her into making a mistake so big it would finally bring everything crashing down around her, and Jacob, the boy she had tried to crush, would end up at the center of a turning point that exposed Karen for exactly what she was. The story was only heating up, and the next confrontation would be one the town would never forget. Karen's obsession had grown into something no one could ignore anymore. She was no longer content with simply calling meetings or sending threatening letters. Instead, she began following Jacob and his parents around town, snapping pictures with her phone whenever they stopped anywhere, whether it was the grocery store, the vet clinic, or even church. Neighbors whispered about how unhinged she looked, muttering to each other that this wasn't about pets or bylaws anymore. This was about power and control. Karen needed to win, even if it meant destroying a child's joy. One Saturday morning, Jacob set up his table again with a few cages of guinea pigs, a litter of kittens needing homes, and some rabbits he had rescued from being abandoned. He smiled brightly when families walked by, explaining how the animals were cared for and giving each potential adopter advice on how to feed and play with them. Kids laughed and begged their parents to take one home, and slowly but surely, the animals began finding new families. It was a wholesome scene that brought warmth to those who watched. But lurking from across the street stood Karen, arms crossed, scowling as though she were witnessing a crime. She pulled out her phone and dialed, and within 20 minutes, a police cruiser pulled up. Jacob's heart sank as the officer stepped out, but this time, the officer recognized him. It was the same one who had come before and reassured him that he wasn't breaking any laws. The officer approached, glanced at Karen, who was waving her arms frantically, and then smiled at Jacob. "Still doing a good job, buddy?" he asked kindly. Jacob nodded nervously. Karen exploded, shouting about illegal business, about disturbing the peace, about pets causing diseases. She practically foamed at the mouth as she screamed, but the officer calmly turned to her and said, "Ma'am, we've been over this. The boy isn't breaking any laws." Karen grew red in the face and shouted that she would press charges anyway. The officer shook his head and walked back to his car, leaving her shrieking on the curb. The families around the table gave Jacob reassuring pats on the shoulder. One mother even muttered loudly that Karen needed to get a life. Jacob smiled, weakly, but inside he was shaken. How long could this go on? His parents were equally fed up. His father decided to file a restraining order against Karen for harassment. But Karen must have caught wind of it, because the very next day she staged her most outrageous stunt yet. She marched straight into the middle of Jacob's pet stand while people were browsing, snatched a rabbit cage off the table and began storming away with it. Jacob cried out, chasing after her, yelling that she couldn't take the animal. His parents rushed forward, and neighbors gasped in disbelief. Jacob's father managed to stop Karen, grabbing the cage from her hands. Demanding to know what she thought she was doing, Karen screamed back that she was rescuing the animal from abuse, her voice shrill and manic, but the crowd had seen enough. Someone had recorded the entire incident on their phone, capturing Jacob's calm, gentle treatment of the animals and Karen's wild, snatching and yelling when the police were called. This time, the officers reviewed the footage and told Jacob's family they had a strong case. Karen tried to shout over them, demanding they arrest Jacob instead, but the officers ignored her, warning her that if she ever touched Jacob's property again, she'd face charges. Jacob, though shaken, was comforted by the outpouring of support he received from the community. More families began rallying behind him, telling him not to give up. Donations poured in for his cause, and even the local newspaper picked up the story. It's running an article about the boy who saves pets despite HOA harassment. Karen was enraged when she saw it, accusing the paper of defamation. She stormed into their office demanding a retraction. But the editor calmly told her they stood by the story. By now, Karen's reputation was in shambles. Parents whispered about not letting their children near her, and neighbors avoided her entirely. But Karen was too blinded by her hatred to realize how far she had fallen. She spent her evenings drafting long complaint emails to city officials, health inspectors, and even the mayor's office, demanding that Jacob be shut down. But each time officials investigated, they found nothing wrong. Jacob's animals were healthy, his stand was clean, and everything was above board. Still, Karen refused to let it go. She hatched a plan to ambush Jacob in front of the entire town during the community festival. The festival was the biggest event of the year, with booths, games, and music and ways. Jacob had been given permission to set up a larger adoption stand there. He was overjoyed, preparing colorful signs and little care packets for new pet owners. His parents helped him organize everything, wanting to make the day special when the festival arrived. Jacob's stand was a hit. Children crowded around, laughing and playing with the kittens. Neighbors congratulated him. And even strangers who had read the newspaper story came to meet him. Jacob glowed with pride. His dream of helping animals was finally being celebrated instead of attacked. But in the middle of the joyful chaos, Karen appeared, striding up to the booth with a furious look. She began shouting over the crowd that Jacob was running an illegal operation. People were being scammed and that the animals were sick. The crowd turned on her immediately, booing and telling her to leave. But Karen was relentless. She tried to shove her way into the booth, knocking over a display. Jacob froze in terror as the kittens mewed in fright, but Jacob's father stepped in, blocking Karen and demanding she stop. Festival security rushed over and dragged her back, but not before she screeched, "This isn't over. You'll all regret siding with him." The scene was chaotic, yet once again, someone had filmed everything, posting the video online. Within hours, it went viral, showing Karen's meltdown in front of children and families. Jacob's story gained national attention. Reporters began calling his family, asking for interviews, and suddenly, what had been a small-town feud turned into a national debate about bullying, harassment, and the misuse of HOA power. Jacob, though overwhelmed, spoke humbly about his mission to help animals. While Karen refused to comment, slamming her door on reporters, the tide had fully turned. Karen was no longer feared but pitied, seen as a bitter woman who had lost all sense of proportion. Yet despite her crumbling reputation, she still clung to her obsession, sitting in her house late at night, surrounded by stacks of papers, plotting her next move, muttering to herself that she would not let a little brat and his mutts defeat her. Little did she know that her final act of defiance was about to cross a line so severe that even the HOA, her longtime shield, would turn against her, setting the stage for a final clash that would expose everything and decide once and for all whether Karen could destroy Jacob's dream or if the community would finally stop her reign of control forever.